Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session. I just wanted to wait a few minutes for everyone to join, but looks like we're ready to go. So welcome today. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to present on our geospatial impact evaluation of the agricultural intensification program in Niger. I'm presenting today for the 3IE team working on this evaluation, which also consists of Anka Dumitrescu and Douglas Glandon, as well as our partners and geospatial experts at New Light Technologies, Ron Goldblatt and Salamawit Tesfaye. So the agenda for today is I will give a brief overview of remote sensing for impact evaluation and why we use remote sensing for this impact evaluation. And then I'll provide an overview of the Niger agricultural intensification project that we focus on, as well as an overview of the project area and the remote sensing data that we collected. And then I'll delve into the preliminary analysis results and our next steps. And then we should have plenty of time for question and answer and discussion at the end. So what is remote sensing? So remote sensing is the science of identifying, observing, collecting data on and measuring objects without coming into direct contact with them. So satellites observe and collect data of the Earth from a distance from the sky. And so different types of land cover and land use on Earth each have unique spectral signatures, which can be used to identify those objects on the Earth from satellites. There are various satellite indices that can be used to measure the different land use on the ground. One of the most commonly used indicators is NDVI, or the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is used to detect and measure changes in live green vegetation on the ground. In order to calculate NDVI, or the level of greenness from a satellite, we take the normalized difference between the near infrared band and the red bands on the satellite. You don't need to know all of the technical details here, but just the key point is that when we're looking at NDVI, for instance, if a lower NDVI, so it can range from -1 to 1, a lower NDVI will indicate that there are less healthy plants, while a higher NDVI will be measuring more vegetation or healthier plants. So why would we want to use remote sensing in the first place? So first of all, we've seen a large increase in measurement studies confirming the validity of different satellite indicators for accurately measuring outcomes and covariates on the ground. For instance, NDVI to measure vegetation. And so remote sensing has become increasingly common in evaluations and monitoring, as evidenced by a big data evidence gap map 3IE conducted previously, which found that most big data studies that were included focused on using remote sensing data as a source. But more importantly, satellite data can increase the efficiency and decrease the cost, time, and effort of data collection and analysis. And it can be available at a greater granularity and frequency, and in remote and fragile areas where you might not be able to get the data on the ground in the first place. And this data can also be gathered more objectively because there's no humans involved in that collection. The satellite data is measuring exactly what we're seeing on the ground. And so 3IE has been diligently developing our capacity in this area over the past few years, including through creating multiple tutorials and presentations, one of which is a hands-on tutorial displaying how to use remote sensing data and how to gather information such as NDVI for different areas, as well as presenting information on the use cases and ethical considerations around remote sensing. So we're now incorporating all this knowledge that we've gained with the help of our partner and geospatial expert, New Light Technologies, into this impact evaluation of this project in Niger. So the project that we're focusing on is this agricultural intensification project for food security in Niger, which is focused on the 3 sites I've listed here. So which I'm going to reference as IB, DG, and NM in the following slides. So this is this project is located in the heart of the Sahel, 2/3 of which is desert with very, very little rainfall. And this region is especially vulnerable to food insecurity and climate change, which is why it's actually common for a lot of these interventions, such as focus on irrigation and food security, to occur in Niger. This particular project is part of a larger regional program, the Special Food Security Program, led by the West African Development Bank, or BOAD. The goal of this project is to contribute to the self-sufficiency and food security of the rural poor by developing at least 7,700 hectares of irrigation systems and related basic infrastructure, including the construction of dams and hydro-agricultural developments, strengthening storage capacity, and improving the organization of producers and microcredits and other infrastructure. This project in particularly is focused on the activities listed here. So in 2011, the government of Niger and the West African Development Bank first signed a financing agreement for the implementation of these projects. Then interventions started occurring in 2013 with tree planting and grasses and rehabilitating the lands, with most activities starting in 2014 with the development of dune fields and restoring other degraded land. And then the primary intervention that we actually focus on today, primarily due to the availability of data, is the agricultural perimeter that was constructed and started to be used in 2018. You can see that in Ibohamane and DG, we see that this started construction and use in 2018, while in the third site, NM, we don't see actually that the agricultural perimeter was developed. And so we're including NM here as a potential control area where we expect that there will be an irrigated agricultural perimeter developed, but it hasn't been yet. So the relevance of geospatial data for this project in particular is that, as I mentioned before, these project sites are extremely remote. This is in a fragile context with a lot of conflict. And so we weren't able to go on the ground and create like a large scale survey on the ground. And so the use of the satellite data allows us to measure this using satellite data instead of regular surveys. And there's a potential to scale and replicate this approach for other components and future programming by BOAD and local governments, as well as through monitoring the implementation and progress of the project team and what is happening on the ground. And so the results of the study will provide valuable information to all of the stakeholders listed here, and especially BOAD, regarding the efficacy of their programs to help inform future regional investments related to climate change as well as food security. So specific to this evaluation, we've taken part in this project through multiple phases. The first phase was focused on data collection. So since, as I mentioned, we didn't have the resources to run an in-depth multi-year survey on the ground, we were able to initially gather some preliminary information which included the mapping of specific areas where the various interventions we've listed before were implemented, including with photos and individuals on the ground mapping those areas for us. This part of the evaluation as well as a possible training on the use of remote sensing. So to give a brief overview of the sites. So for each of the 3 sites, as I mentioned, we had individuals on the ground map the intervention areas with details on what intervention was taking place and photos taken of the areas as they went around and mapped these. And so depicted here, we have the first site, Ibohamane, which is shown here in the image on the right. And you can see, for instance, that the dunes and agricultural areas are the areas that were mapped in blue. The irrigated agricultural perimeters in green, and so on. So we can see the variety and the extent of the different interventions occurring in this entire region. We have the same thing for the other 2 sites, including DG, so shown here. And then also for NM, in this case, it's harder to see the polygons, but we zoomed out to show that this region is really close to Niamey, the city center, and a river that runs through the area, which indicates that it's potentially, while we're using it as a control group in this scenario, it's potentially different from the other regions just based on the topography. And I've also included an image that was taken on the ground by the individuals that were mapping the polygons, so we could verify what was being seen. So one way that we can visualize this is by looking at the change in vegetation, or NDVI, in, for instance, the first region here in Ibohamane across months in 2018. So this is just looking month over month over the course of a year, and we can see how drastically the levels of vegetation are changing just within 1 year. Generally, there's higher levels of greenery in the rainy and high cultivation months. We can also look at the change over or across years. So here we're looking at the NDVI in 2010 and then the NDVI in 2022. And then we take the difference between the gain and loss, or we take the difference between the NDVI in 2022, 2010, and get the gain and loss on the left here. Of course, this is just a simple difference between these 2 years, and this is a large time jump. So there's possibly a lot of different factors causing this increase, including other interventions and programming that are occurring in the region and just changes in climatic conditions over time. And so in reality, we want to look more closely at the trends on a monthly basis and in more specific areas. So for instance, if we zoom into one of just the irrigation perimeter within this site, we can see just a basic image here of in 2016 of what the site looked like then, and then what it looks like in 2019 after the irrigated perimeter was implemented. So compared to 2019, we can clearly see, compared to 2016, before the irrigation perimeter was implemented, we can see that there clearly was some construction and increase in greenery in the area, as we might expect. However, for this analysis, we want to take this a step further beyond just visualizing this change, which can already be relatively informative. We want to confirm whether this change is, in fact, as a result of the intervention. And so we want to see what the specific impact on NDVI, or vegetation growth, has been over time in this region. So I'm going to delve into the preliminary analysis and findings so far. Just as an overview, the focus of this evaluation is on the impact of these various activities in these 3 different sites on production and vegetation, water availability, siltation, and desertification. This analysis is focused primarily on production and vegetation, particularly in the irrigation perimeter that I just showed, because we're looking at NDVI, which, as I mentioned, is generally used to measure vegetation changes. Before delving into the analysis, I want to give a brief overview here of our methodology. And so, again, for this preliminary analysis, we primarily looked at the watershed level, so looking at the 3 sites as a whole and all of those polygons together, rather than individual polygons. As I just showed, we were able to see some of the changes in the construction just by looking at the images, but we also wanted to look at the trends more specifically over time in NDVI. We also looked at NDWI and SAVI, which I'm not presenting here, but is part of our next steps as well. And we're looking at using different types of satellite data, including Landsat 7, Landsat 8, and Sentinel-2. Some of you may know this, but generally these different satellite. Oh yeah? Okay. Was there any question? No. Okay, so just to note that the different satellite data sources have different pros and cons. So for instance, Sentinel-2 will give us more granular data, but it doesn't have data going back as far. And so I think it starts in 2015, which, or 2016, right before the intervention, which wouldn't give us enough time prior to look at changes. While Landsat 7 goes back much, much further, and we can look at it starting, for instance, in 2010 or earlier. So we also did some sensitivity checks, including focusing on specific months to account for the seasonality, and then including precipitation as a potential control. So looking at the 3 regions as a whole, as I just mentioned, so we've got specifically looking at Landsat 7 vegetation changes from 2010 to 2022. We can see from the raw data just the average monthly NDVI from 2010 to 2022. The red here in this graph is the first region, IB, the purple is DG, and the gray is Niamey. And we have noted here the 2 main different times of the intervention. So in 2014, we had a lot of different things starting up. In 2018, we had the irrigation parameters starting to be used. So when we're looking at this raw data, it's hard to see the patterns here. There's beyond noting there's some clear seasonality going on. So we aggregated up to the average yearly values to see the trend year over year. The regions are actually still following similar patterns to each other, with a spike in 2012 and a decrease in 2022, which is actually when there was a severe drought in Niger. So the trends are generally following what we would expect to see. Though we see less of an increase, we see a little bit of a dip in DG and Ibohamane from 2014 to 2018, because that's around the time when the irrigation perimeter was under construction. So potentially there was less cultivation going on due to that construction. While in Niamey, the region where we know there was no irrigation perimeter constructed, we're still seeing similar, the trends are continuing in the same way as they were before in that time, which is why we include Niamey as a controlled region in this case, just to show the general trends potentially in Niger as a whole over time, or a similar region, even if there's slight differences. So however, for impact evaluation, we're really interested in the average fitted trend or change over time before and after the intervention. So we graphed the fitted line before and after the irrigation perimeter began to be used in 2018. In essence, this is what we would do for an interrupted time series design, which looks at both the change at the time of the intervention in 2018, as well as the change in the slope before and after, or before versus after. We would likely want to do this for each intervention area instead of the region as a whole. This is currently the entire region, and ensure that we have the accurate control groups and controls included, but it helps to already visualize this change over time. We can see, for instance, that Ibohamane, there's a decrease, or like there's a jump up after in 2018 of the NDVI vegetation levels, as well as an increase in the vegetation over time compared to what we were seeing as a decline beforehand on average. In Niamey, we're seeing essentially a continuation of trends. There's a slight decline in 2018, but it looks like trends are staying as we would expect, since nothing's actually occurring in NM, or the gray line, in 2018. We see a slight decline in DG after the intervention occurred, though, again, as I noted, there was a drought in 2022, which may be driving this change. Of course, we still would include that, but just to note, so if we take out 2022, we can see that there is actually an increase, and much larger increase in all the areas, which essentially is just indicating we would still keep in the drought, since that's likely a common occurrence, but we want to control for rainfall and precipitation in our actual analysis to account for things such as climatic conditions. So we also looked at just Ibohamane, so looking at one region at a time to help clarify what we're seeing there. So again, we're looking at this entire region as a whole. All of these polygons and interventions are included. If we just look at compare the vegetation to the rainfall in Ibohamane, we can see that the trends are very similar. For when there's higher rainfall, we're seeing higher vegetation, as we might expect. Especially, so again, we're showing here like the seasonality and how that ties together with rainfall as well. I've also included a graph of Sentinel-2 just to show that while there might be a little bit more sensitivity in Sentinel-2, generally they're very similar trends. So we're and on average, it looks very much the same. And the problem with using Sentinel-2 again is it only starts in 2016, while for Landsat 7 satellite data, we can go further back. So again, there's clearly there's a rainy season and a dry season, which seem to align with the growth and cultivation cycles. So to account for some of this seasonality, we also broke down our analysis by season. So we can graph here the regional, or we've got the yearly NDVI on the left, and then the average trend line before and after on the right. In general, for the rainy season, which is denoted here in green, it's higher on average, as we might expect, than the dry season, but following generally similar trends, perhaps with a slightly more significant increase after the intervention in the rainy season than the dry season. So this is just a way of performing this analysis to deal with issues of seasonality and to answer a slightly different question, which is how much worse or better off are we in our main cultivation period compared to previous years, rather than how is it changing over the course of the year. So one other thing that we've started doing is looking at a polygon level, so looking at specific sites. As of right now, I've been talking a lot about this 2018 cutoff when the irrigation perimeter was starting to be used. However, a lot of these interventions are not necessarily related to the irrigation perimeter. So we actually want to look more closely at that specific area, which is outlined in green. So if we just take the NDVI for this area to see how it's changed before and after this irrigation perimeter was put in, we can then see the change in NDVI just for that specific smaller location. And so we're seeing generally similar trends. Again, there's a lot of seasonality with a potential slight increase after the intervention was implemented in 2018. Here we can see, like, in general, it looks like there's more of an increase afterwards. And if we again collapse that to the trends before and after, we're seeing this big jump in NDVI at the time of the intervention, as well as an increase in the trend over time. So this preliminary analysis in general indicates that there's been an increase in vegetation as measured by NDVI and Ibohamane over time, particularly following the implementation of that irrigation perimeter in 2018. However, I want to note that this is just essentially monitoring the changes in vegetation, but doesn't determine the impact of the program yet. So while there is an increase in the greenery immediately after the program was implemented, this change might be influenced by other factors occurring, such as droughts, increased rainfall, potentially other types of rehabilitation activities that occurred at the same time across Niger. And so in the next steps, we want to make sure to include a valid control and comparison region to isolate the effect and consider seasonality and changes in rainfall. So the seasonality generally, as I've shown, needs to be considered just because it aligns with the changes in rainfall and when things are actually being cultivated. It's also important to carefully select our indicators based on what we're interested in measuring. So for instance, we did some analysis with NDWI, which I haven't presented, but NDWI essentially measures water levels or changes in water, and it's not as relevant in areas where it's very dry and there is no water. And so looking at NDWI for the region as a whole doesn't make as much sense as looking at NDWI for a specific watershed area to see how much whether there was an increase in that water or not. And so that's something to consider in general when using these satellite sources and indicators. We also want to make sure that we're always ground truthing when possible. Of course, the benefit of remote sensing data is that you don't necessarily need to go on the ground in areas where you're not able to. However, having some sense of when the intervention occurred where, and making sure you're in contact with the team that implemented the intervention to see, to make sure that what you're seeing from the sky is actually accurate is very important. And so again, like admin data might not always be clear. And so we want to make sure we stay in contact with teams on the ground when possible. And we also need to consider a lot of the measurement errors. So for instance, if we're comparing different geographic areas, we would need to take into account how those might influence what we're seeing. For instance, also if there's more cloud cover or more rain in one area versus another, we want to make sure we're accounting for that or accounting for any gaps in the data because of it. And then there's also the trade-offs between the different satellite sources that I briefly mentioned. So we want to make sure in our analysis, we're going to try and compare and use each source like Landsat 7 versus Sentinel-2 to confirm that we're seeing similar results as we might expect. So our next steps are to look at more of the polygon level analysis, looking at specific intervention areas I'd outlined, looking at each site component individually. We also are considering doing a more granular pixel level analysis, so taking specific pixels within each polygon and comparing those to pixels outside of the polygons. And then we're going to look at the other outcomes in more detail, NDWI and SAVI. SAVI, I don't know if I mentioned this, but it's similar to NDVI, but generally used in more dry and arid regions, which might be more useful in our case, since this region, as I mentioned, has very little rainfall. Then we're working on the intervention design. Primarily, we've been looking at interrupted time series and controlled interrupted time series. We also, since we have our data over time at a very granular level, it's possible to do this interrupted time series analysis. However, as I mentioned, we want to make sure we're including a control site for anything that might be occurring at the same time. We're also considering a difference in design with the potential for synthetic control, where we find various areas around our region that might be similar and then match those based on background trends and characteristics. And then also potentially a geographic regression discontinuity for certain areas, though this will depend on whether or not the land that was used to begin is better to begin with than the land immediately outside of those polygons that we've included. And finally, we're staying in contact with the BOAD and the Niger government, because we want to make sure that in the long term, this is useful also for the monitoring capacity, and we may be proposing some trainings on the use of geospatial data for monitoring and evaluation. All right, I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to take a look at the Q&A as well. Feel free to drop your questions in there. Okay. So Jordan is asking that we want to, sorry, I only see part of the answer. Okay. Yes, Jordan. So I think that we are both looking at NDVI on a seasonal and an annual level, but it depends. We can either break it down by seasonal level or include a control for the seasonality, like include the monthly value as well to control for that change. And that's essentially what we do with interrupted time series design. Yeah, so Renzo is asking if we could explain the assignment mechanism of the treatment and how we're taking that into account in our analysis. So as I mentioned, we're just considering different designs, but for instance, the irrigation perimeter may have been constructed in an area where they would expect more growth to be possible to begin with. So they're not randomly, these areas are not randomly assigned, which is why we would use a quasi-experimental method like interrupted time series or diff and diff to control for that, the differences that are there to begin with between the different areas that we might look at. With the interrupted time series design, also the slope beforehand, or the change in growth, the trend that's occurring beforehand, is used as a control essentially that accounts for, so any change in that is considered the difference compared to what we would expect to see if there was a continuation. However, as I mentioned, we're looking into bringing in other control areas as well. Great question on what is the reason for the lower vegetation in DG. This is exactly what we're hoping to look into in more detail. So exactly. So the question is, why would this irrigation perimeter be having more of an impact in Ibohamane versus in DG? This is something that might require asking more questions on the ground as well, unfortunately, but we're hoping to look into this in more detail and investigating it further. Yes, exactly. Focus. So it looks like, I don't know, I can see Anka typing. Okay, so you can, oh, wait, the question disappeared. Okay, so I'm gonna answer Imtiaz's question. So could I describe the difference between NDVI and SAVI? Yeah, this is also a great question, something we're hoping to explore through this analysis. So generally SAVI is considered to, it adjusts for arid and dry regions. And so it's better at detecting vegetation when there isn't much vegetation to begin with. And so we're thinking SAVI might be more focused and useful for this analysis. But again, we're planning to use both to see, because ideally there wouldn't be a big difference in which indicator we use because they're both measuring vegetation. But it could be useful to see whether SAVI is able to give us a more detailed look at the changes in NDVI over time, especially since this area is very dry to begin with. Okay, so great question on whether there are any cost benefits in using remote sensing versus some other approach. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, remote sensing can be very useful both in cases where you just have no other option, like if you can't go on the ground because there is too much conflict or it's too remote to reach very easily, then generally there will be increased costs associated with ensuring safety and making sure you have transport and are able to get to those regions versus having using remote sensing data, which in our case, we are actually using open source data, which doesn't cost any money to collect or gather. So for instance, Landsat 7, 8, and Sentinel-2 are all free for the public to download data from. And so in general, the costs associated with data collection are nearly zero compared to the cost of going on the ground and collecting that data. Of course, you need to be aware of how to use that data. There might be a learning curve in figuring out how to collect it. And in some cases, you might actually have to pay for more granular data if you're looking at a very specific or small site, in which case there are not open source versions that you could use. And related to this, yeah, it's very important to interact with beneficiaries and implementers on the ground. This is something we've also been struggling with a little bit, as I mentioned. So we were in contact with the beneficiaries on the ground initially to figure out what was occurring where and when. But after that, it's hard to stay in contact and to reach out again. And so this is something we're working on currently. And is something we would love to hear other people's experience on, as well as how do you make sure that you are ground truthing to the best of your ability. Because there are cases where potentially you might see that it doesn't look like something was implemented that you thought should. And so then it's always good to stay in contact to begin with so that you can reach out later easily and ask, is there something going on? Why does it look like this wasn't implemented? And then we definitely want to build the local capacity. So as I mentioned, we're hoping to have some trainings set up some trainings with BOAD and develop some of the capacity and use cases for remote sensing. We also have developed a training in the past on how to collect this data. And I'm happy to share any of that if you want to reach out to us after. I can go back to the beginning where my email is listed. Sorry. Okay, So I have my email here. Feel free to reach out for more details and if you're interested in seeing the training. So let me see. Okay, so Cesar is asking, these types of development interventions typically involve technical assistance that promote changes in the crop portfolio. Do we know which crops are planted before and after? Can we expect an increase in NDVI to mean a positive effect, or are there other situations where a drop in NDVI is a positive effect too? This is a really great question. This is a mistake that another reason why ground truthing or knowing specifically what crops are being used is important, because you're right. For instance, certain crops, when they are right before they're being harvested, are actually not green per se. They are gray or they're brown when you're cultivating them. And so in those cases, I guess you could see a slight drop in NDVI, but I'm assuming that if the difference between that plant not being that crop not being under production and being there is going to be very similar. So I don't know if you would see a drop necessarily, but you definitely want to account for this. And so our assumption is that at certain points, so we're looking at specific crops that are green at one point or another, even if it's not at the very end. So they might be green and then they turn brown over time, but there will be an increase at one point or another compared to beforehand. But this is definitely something we advocate looking into and making sure that if you're looking at a certain crop that's never going to be green, then it might not be useful to use NDVI. You would want to look at other types of categorization. So the problem of heterogeneity, we haven't thought about looking at heterogeneity yet. So we would consider potentially we're looking at using various different controls, such as the differences in elevation and temperature and rainfall, in order to account for differences between our area and the potential control areas. So for instance, with Niamey, we know that that's in an area that has a different elevation and is right by the water. And so we would want to control for those factors. We don't have, since we only have a few areas or regions that we're looking at, I'm not sure that we'll be breaking it down more than that, but we definitely want to control for some of the differences we might see in the areas. And again, like we're going to do that by controlling for rainfall and elevation amongst some other potential covariates. Is there a difference between vegetation index and greenness index? So when I'm referring to greenness, I'm generally referring to vegetation, to the NDVI index. Sorry for the confusion. Let me see. Okay. I'm going to answer a few more questions. Looks like we have a few more minutes. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, is there a control area to understand the changes without the intervention? It's a great question. We're currently exploring different potential control areas. Again, we use Niamey in this case because we know that there wasn't a construction of the irrigation perimeter that was occurring yet, though they expect there to be construction at some point, which makes it at least similar in the sense that it is an area in which having an irrigation perimeter is considered to be useful. Of course, that area is slightly different. So as I mentioned, we're looking at other similar watersheds that we can potentially use as a control. Let's see. How likely is it that the treated units could be affected by neighbors in terms of vegetation coverage changes? Are we considering using spatial lags? Yeah, this is a good question as well. Again, I think the benefit of us hopefully looking at a polygon level is that we have extremely detailed information on what occurred in each polygon. So we are working with the teams on the ground to understand which seeds were used and whether there were different types of seeds in some some areas versus others, but we will, if we do, especially if we do a regression discontinuity design, we would have to consider using some spatial lags to control for whether or not the boundary is actually including the areas that had the seeds versus outside of it. For the case of the irrigation perimeter, we can very clearly see where the perimeter was put in place. And so we, in that case, are hoping to use a control group without having to use the regression discontinuity design. Let's see, I'm going to answer the last two questions, and then feel free to reach out to us also with more questions later. So, are there any plans to model the results to see the impact on human and animal health? So that is not part of our current study plans, but an interesting question. I think some of these human and animal health might be easier to measure using, again, administrative data or data on the ground, but would be interested in seeing a study that looks at that as well. And then, which remote sensing image do you recommend for measuring changes in crop growth and flood prediction, since most of the images have heavy cloud cover? Yeah, this is also a great question. We've been working, again, with our partners, New Light Technologies, to make sure that we account for how much cloud cover there is, and to make sure that the images that we drop due to cloud cover are not in certain months, or there's certain times and that we just have gaps in. In general, the Landsat and the Sentinel data has been relatively good, has had relatively good coverage, even considering cloud cover. Generally, we have an image, at least one image for each month. And so I would recommend taking a look at that, but happy to put you in contact with the rest of our team as well. Great. So if there are any other questions, I think I'm going to stop us there. But if there are any other questions, please reach out. Again, my email is here, and anyone on the team would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you all.